many as we can at the end of both presentations. This afternoon's event, we're going to hear from two wonderful speakers who I will introduce in just a moment. Following that, our Chief Exec, Estelle Bailey, is going to come on and announce the winners of this year's Be Bout photography competition, which was a fantastic competition, and we'll get to look at some beautiful pictures at the end of the session. But first, we are absolutely delighted to welcome two fantastic speakers this afternoon. First up, you're going to hear from Professor Tim Lang. Now, he was professor for food policy at City University and for decades has been interested in the relationships between food, health, environment, and culture. He's currently working on improving food systems and food resilience and defense, kind of a topical topic at the moment. Vicki Hird, who you'll hear from after Tim, is a campaigner and a strategist. Till the end of this past week, she was at Sustain and is also now working for the Central Wildlife Trusts, advising and leading on agricultural issues. She also has a book, Rebugging the Planet, which examines why insects are so essential to our ecosystems. We know how important food is. It's not something you can give up. It's absolutely critical. A lot of us really enjoy it. And so learning more about what we eat, how we get it, where it comes from, how it's produced, and how the whole system links together, or doesn't sometimes, is kind of what we wanted to get to, and really how it's so important in terms of nature, climate, and the environment. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Professor Tim Lang. The next 20 minutes are all yours, Tim.
Very good. Thanks very much, Karen. And thanks to Be Bout for inviting me. I was brought up mostly in India as a child until I was nearly 8, but then we went and lived in Buckinghamshire, my parents did. So I know it pretty well. And yesterday, I live in inner London, very inner London. Yesterday, 2 days ago, I was putting out some washing, as one does. And lo and behold, there was a red kite circling above my house. And I thought, goodness me, I've never seen one of those in central London. But there we go. So look, you've got my slides. I've done quite a lot of slides. They're pretty intense. That's so that you can look at them later. I think it's very, very important that we understand the evidence of some of these issues that we argue and discuss. Vicki and I know each other very well for decades, and it's actually a great pleasure for me to do this with Vicki on the beginnings of her new role, because I used to chair Sustain, and indeed I helped found it and both its predecessors 35 years ago. So it's very nice to do this with Vicki. My message, can I have the next slide, please? I always put in the first slide what I'm going to say, and then you can fall asleep. I mean, essentially, if we want to understand the British food system, we use this language of a system because it's no longer at any point talking about agriculture or horticulture or hospitality. You've got to put the whole of the food system, from supply inputs right through to how we consume and what we do with our waste, if we're to understand food's impact on nature. And eating is, if I say one sentence, and then you can go to sleep, it's how we eat, what we eat, and how what we eat is produced, processed, and delivered to us is probably the biggest, and certainly among the biggest, impacts on the planet. It's the biggest user of water, it's the biggest land user, it's the biggest employer, it's the biggest cause of premature death, it's the biggest driver of ill health. In other words, unless we tackle the food system, the relationship between public health and ecosystems health, i.e. us and the planet, is frankly doomed. And it's not good at the moment. People like me are actually very sober. I spent my life working in this. I was a farmer, an organic farmer, 50 years ago for the best part of a decade. But then in the last 40 years, have been mostly an academic, but sometimes running think tanks and occasionally campaigns. So I don't know if you've been reading this, but essentially In Britain, we have particular idiosyncrasies. We have this imperial legacy from 1846 thinking everyone else would feed us. It was called an empire. We haven't got that anymore. We've left the European Union. What are we doing about that? We don't produce all of our own food, only 54% actually. The ownership and the power of the food industry is highly concentrated. The good news for people like Vicki and I, talk to 8 retailers and you're talking to the food system and the gatekeepers of it. But what do we do about that for protecting nature? These retailers say, oh, we can't do anything. It's all about the consumer, and they keep batting it backwards and forwards. So actually wildlife trusts have to get real about that power and influence. Consumption is distorted. We're over-consuming, mal-consuming, and great pockets of Britain, big slabs of Britain, are under-consuming. We've seen in the cost of living crisis how that's impacting upon us. And the 4th bullet point, it's a huge impact. It's the biggest driver of climate change, of Western consumers, biodiversity loss, the biggest user of water, land use, and the photograph of the beautiful Buckinghamshire be about sort of terrain that you claim, that to me is a nightmare. It's the legacy of animal culture, not horticulture. Animal culture helping drive ecosystems destruction, actually, I'll put it pretty starkly. And yet we need to turn it round. That's not to say that animals haven't got their place. They've become too big, and how we're using them and growing them, processing them and so on, and managing them is a critical issue. And it's on your doorstep. It's down your mouth. It's a socially divided factor. Diet is one of the biggest factors in the enormous gap now between rich and poor dying. In Victorian eras, even the rich died of diseases. In the current age, it's 12 years life expectancy between, say, the top 5% and bottom 5% and top 10%, bottom 10%. Literally, I mean, I wrote a book called Feeding Britain. It came out the first week of lockdown, so 3 years ago. And literally, I pointed out that in the richest part of London to an area of London 3 miles away, the life expectancy gap was 12 years. I mean, this is literally around us. It's how and what we do. The cultural mismatch is enormous. You know, we can eat the world. You know, say, what do I want to eat tonight? Well, I'll eat Thai, or I'll eat Indian, or I'll go for an Italian. You know, we're doing this in a way with, I mean, it's fantastic compared to when I came back to live in England when I was 8. You know, British food was brown. Now it's wonderfully diverse, but it's not the whole picture. And policymakers, Vicki and I would agree, our lives have spent in policy. Brexit hasn't helped us, but there was a big crisis before that. And we're not making use of where we are now at all. But there are good things going on. And people like you, the wildlife trusts, are really important. I'll say my big personal message always, which is amidst anything that you do for landscape as wild trusts, please get some horticulture in there. Sustainable horticulture is the paramount priority of food and reconnecting the Brits to their landscape. If we continue to eat in the way that we do, we're basically sealing our undoing. And if you just say, well, don't worry, we'll look after our bit of the landscape and we'll import more food, well, you're then being a parasite, basically. And I'm not saying grow pineapples or bananas in Berkshire. On the contrary, I'm saying we have to think very carefully about the transition that is being forced on us. Let me be very clear. It's being forced on us, but we need to actually get a grip of it and sort it out. So this is very tricky, and it requires big alliances. It requires us to talk with corporates, but not necessarily accept everything that everyone says. And it's a very delicate problem. Okay, next slide. I can go faster now. This is a very complicated slide. It's actually 2 slides. If you didn't think or know the data on how important food is, on the left, food accounts for at least a quarter of greenhouse gas emissions. On the right of this slide, you can look at all of these later. Different foods have different impacts. Basically, the more you go up this slide, the right-hand slide, you get towards dairy and meats, the impact goes up, basically. And I spent 4 years of my life on a huge, and one of the most highly cited scientific papers of the last decade, a report called the Eat Lancet Commission. I spent 4 years as policy head of that, trying to work out what are we going to do about this impact? And it requires us in the rich West to eat very differently in order to allow the rest of the world, particularly the poor world, to eat better. And that's a very delicate restructuring of land use. Next slide, please. Here, very specifically, is Britain's greenhouse gases. You can see that not everything is to do with food about greenhouse gases, but agriculture is up there at the top. What we do with our land and how we use it is extremely important. It matters if we import foods, it matters what our food and drink manufacturing is, but agriculture is the really big one. But if you just said, oh, well, it's only about agriculture, people like me say, no, it isn't. Because if you're going to sort out what you want out of agriculture, you've got to get a grip of food manufacturing. You've got to get a grip of packaging, because the packaging drives processing and drives how things are given to consumers and then ends up as rubbish and waste. It's not necessarily a big greenhouse gas impact, but it has a very big driving effect on how the food system works. Next slide, please. You can look at all of these later. This is 3 slides. This is just me wanting to rub it very clearly into my brain, let alone your brain, how important food is. And over time, there are trends which are very interesting. On the left-hand side, Britain's greenhouse gas emissions are actually coming down very gently. But the bad news about that is that some of that is due to food industry getting a bit more wise to this and starting to address some of it. But some of it's just to do with when we're allowing those emissions to occur far off and far away. And there are different, on the bottom, the one that I've rather crudely ringed from the Agriculture, Horticulture and Development Board a couple of years ago. I do want to remind you that things like transport are very, very important. What we all do, it's complex. So there's a welter of data that people like Vicki and I help try to negotiate through, make sense of. Next slide, please. The impacts are enormous. As Karen said in her introduction to me, I'm currently working on a very, very serious piece of research, a report that I'm doing for a body in and around government, looking at what happens, how resilient is Britain? And I'm particularly interested in the public. How resilient is the public? Are they prepared for shocks? Because they're coming. They're on us slowly already, and others will come. And we've had specific shocks for a long time, actually, which have been early warning. They've been sort of canary tweets, if you like. I've listed some down on the left. And then we've got these long-running ones that we've normalized. We take them for granted. Oh, climate change. Oh, yeah, that's normal. Well, actually, it's not normal. This is being heavily driven. Well, it's heavily driven by us, people, but heavily driven by the food system within our impacts. Next slide, please. I'm a policy man. I set up still the world's only specialist research center looking at food policy. It's now over 30 years old at City University. You couldn't be far further from agriculture and the conventional sense of the land, but it's really good because it's where the power is, and it's where capital is. It's where the big companies tend to be based and so on. So it's actually given us a really good opportunity to be, if you like, an observatory of how the food system works. And why we're there partly is because we're interested in policy. What are the policymakers doing? Are they taking note of all these data and the warnings of its own advice system? I mean, the Committee on Climate Change says time and time again, we have to change what we eat as well as how we're producing our food, and it sinks. Government does nothing. The food industry sort of says, yeah, of course we think it's important. And what do we get? Very little change. And this here is the sort of thing I spend my working life on, just looking how the state of British food policy is fragmented, is weak, leaving the European Union has disrupted it, and we still haven't replaced it. We haven't got a Food Act replacing the Common Agricultural Policy. We've got an Agriculture Act, but it didn't hardly mention food. And yet how the food system works shapes what agriculture does. So there are lots of things going on and not going on that require us and you as Wildlife Trust to be very involved in the policy world, which is why it's wonderful. The Royal Society of Wildlife Trust has employed Vicki, because you've got a great person there to help you do it. Next slide, please. Well, I've said this already. There's, if you're interested, policy wonks like me know this UK Food Security Report. When getting the Agriculture Bill for England through the House of Commons, some of us persuaded the House of Lords to demand that there was an annual review of food security in Britain. We didn't get that, but we got a 3-yearly review. The first one of that came out very conveniently, i.e., I think deliberately, at a time when it would get no publicity, the last working day before Christmas 2 years ago. It's actually a very interesting report, but it ducks lots of the questions that we now need to address. How much food do we want to grow? Where? How? And the difficulties are piling up. Some of them are quite nicely summarized in that report, by the way, and I've put the link there. But basically, Britain is an importer. It's a parasite. We're living on our imperial past. We're living on the European past. We're not taking our own land use to feed ourselves seriously, and farmers aren't getting the guidance. And we've got this whole movement of rewilding, which somehow severing ecosystems damage onto how we eat. Next slide, please. You can look at all of these slides later. There's a lot of detail in them. Here are the figures on sufficiency, long-term. I'm interested in long-term trends. 1960 on the left, you know, the peak point was in the early 1980s. Britain was producing about 80% of its own food, and then gently it's declined. It's gone stable. But the government's latest figures are basically we're producing about 54% of our food. And where we get it from is overwhelming. It's still from the European Union. There's a fantasy that we've left Europe. Europe's feeding us. And we've made the gaps, the difficulties of getting food in and out, exports and imports, more difficult. And that's a real problem, actually, a very, very serious problem for the farming industry, indeed for the food processing industry. Next slide. But it's not just about that farming stuff. It's about how we eat. And these are just some slides to make that point. There is a great concern in my world, my center, the center I don't run anymore because I'm technically retired. We're very concerned. We're based in a public health department. We're concerned about the impacts on public health. People like me are saying, well, the public health, human health impacts of the food system are linked to how we're doing not dissimilar damage to ecosystems. And there's a very interesting argument people like you are now involved in, which is, are we not just eating too much processed foods when we don't know what are in them, but we're eating particular sorts of processed foods, what we call ultra processed foods, meaning foods which are highly manufactured, full of fats, salts and sugar, and are held together by emulsifiers and colorants to make it look like food. And those are changing the nature of food. Well, that's my sort of interest, possibly not yours, except as consumers. But I put this in. Next slide, please. We've got cost of living problems. These are all pressures. You're thinking, well, why is he talking about this? We're interested in wildlife. But this is the world in which, if one is interested, and I say I am interested in wildlife and ecosystems and food, one has to know that the arguments for wildlife and food are jostling for attention with policymakers with other issues. Cost of living is really number one for outside track policymakers. Government has tended to duck it, actually. It might have taken energy seriously, but it hasn't done much about food, you might have noticed. But the volatility of prices is a very critical issue. And one of the things that's happened since the oil price crisis of 2007-8, when oil went to over $100 a barrel, was that food prices have been volatile ever since. What's oil got to do with food? Fertilizers. It's oil and gas which have enabled farming to become so-called more efficient. And that's our problem. Next slide, please. Basically, Britain's land use is, I think, distorted. It's away with the fairies, if I'm honest. The total amount of land we've got is 18 million hectares. About 6 of those, a third, are croppable in the formal term. Horticulture is not even in the millions. It's not even in the quarter of a million. It's only about 165,000 hectares. And yet that is where the foundation of health comes from, which is fruit, vegetables, and of course, grains and cereals. A huge proportion of the grains and cereals we grow in Britain are fed to animals. We're distorting by our love affair with meat, and I speak as an ex-beef and sheep farmer, I should have said, to shape ecosystems as well as public health. Next slide, please. If you think these things don't matter, I always just say think water. The Brits say, oh, well, we're a wet country, we've not got a problem. That is the map of the environment agencies of areas which are water stressed. We're not thinking through water use, and food is embedded water. When I have 1 cup of coffee a day, my cup of coffee is about 140 liters of embedded water. We can think totally different about what the food is and its impact on the environment by looking at embedded carbon, embedded water, embedded nitrogen, embedded phosphates, and indeed embedded human labor. And the one that I think is coming up very fast on Britain is embedded water. Next slide, please. I was born in Lincoln, so I'm interested in that bit around the Wash. It's going to go underwater, basically. It's stopped from being underwater and being marshland. Some of us, myself included, really like it when it's marshland, but it's where most of our horticulture comes from. We're having to think through very big land use issues very fast, and government's ducking it, if I'm honest, not making the connection. Next slide, please. Next slide. How am I doing? Okay, what can we do very quickly before I wrap up? Next slide, please. Basically, government, I'm saying, is being silent. Next slide. You can look at all of these. I think there are pathways. People like me develop these sort of things. There are ways we can develop a transition in food over 30 years to lower the impact. Next slide, please. You can look at all of these things. There is wonderful experimentation. Vicki, working for Sustain, a really helpful organization, of which I'm very proud, starting bodies and helping nurture and publicize bodies, small horticultural organization, experimentation of new relationships between towns and the countryside. In my report I'm working on at the moment, very interesting international experience in France, huge developments of a movement called Terre et Ville, town and countryside. We should be learning from these and developing these here. Now, you in Wildlife Trust said, well, we don't want that. We don't want horticulture. We want more wildlife. There is no contradiction between horticulture and wildlife. It depends how we do it. Next slide, please. And I put this up, in my book, Feeding Britain, I was very critical of NEP. There's really wonderful transition that the Burrell family did, and Isabella Tree, Mrs. Burrell, her wonderful book. I was critical of it because it said, well, you've gone from producing food to producing only meat. I eat all my words. Last year, I hope from criticisms and people like me, they started a market gardening program. Fantastic. Go and have a look at it. Next slide, please, and then I'll finish. Next slide, please. Let's get to the end. Let's get to the end. Go to the end. Okay, stop. No, go back to that one. Whoa. Go back. Back. Yeah, back one more. I think we're all about investing in the good stuff. This is my handover to Vicki. That top right photo, I love. This is about getting food growing to an orchard. Reconnecting with whatever we want to grow for food. This is sheep. My own family contributed to the beginnings of agroforestry in one part of the UK. And we've got to develop things like this. But the reality is much more at the bottom. Migrant labor picking field crops in very difficult circumstances for low wages because the Brits don't want to work on it. We've got some very serious issues away from wildlife that we've got to address. But to summarize the last sentence, Karen, basically, the message is potentially very good, but at the moment, we're not in a good place. And Wildlife Trust, one of the many reasons I've done this, and I've known Craig Bennett, the chief exec of the combined Wildlife Trust for years. And I think you're in a very important role now and place to connect and to be a force to connect and get governments to start reshaping food systems to enable us to have both human health and ecosystems health. Thanks.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much, Tim. A few questions have already started coming in. So a reminder that if you do have some as Vicki speaks as well, to put them into the Q&A box at the bottom, and we will try to address as many as we can at the end. But without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Vicki Hird to give us her take on this topic, and then we'll do some questions at the end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen, and to Bebout for inviting me and Tim. It's actually lovely, as Tim said, to do a talk with him. And I'm doing this talk as Sustain because I don't want to speak out of turn as the strategic lead on agriculture at the Wildlife Trusts, the Royal Society, the Wildlife Trusts. So everything I say is sort of with Sustain, but it's also going to be make Tim very happy to know that I will be working on a lot of this at Wildlife Trusts, including horticulture, which I'm very pleased about because it is, as he said, extremely important. So it's with that switch that I'm speaking, but still with it very much think about Sustain as sort of where I'm coming from. And on this slide, you can see it's a local farmers market I've got where I live in London, which is organic, and therefore it's allowing a huge amount of organic farming and farmers to survive and have a good living in an environment where it's very difficult for organic farmers to survive, which I'll go on to anyway. But that's a picture of a garden tiger moth I found in Scotland. Anyway, I've got a few pictures of invertebrates because invertebrates are my much bigger love. Anyway, next slide, please. I'll probably I'll talk quickly about Sustain and what I thought I'd do, because I knew Tim would be brilliant and he'd go over things and there's a lot to think about. So I'll probably sort of go over quite a bit of what he said, but drill into it a bit more detail and think about the trade-offs and issues. So just to finish, Sustain is about 110 organisations, ranging from the RSPB and the Wildlife Trust to Royal Society of Public Health to all the organic bodies. It's a very large and animal welfare bodies, all interested in total or in part of a food system that really works for everybody. Everybody gets a fair deal and nature and climate is tackled, and also work at sort of the international level, looking at international trade. Next slide, please. So key messages from Tim and from our work and from our research is that we do have a broken food system. It's not feeding us well. We've got the malnutrition from excess, as Tim talked about, the ultra-processed food, and malnutrition from people not being able to eat enough. It's not working for farmers, and I will touch on that. So it's not working for consumers in terms of having a good cultural offer and ability to cook good fresh food, and it's not working for society in terms of its impact on the very environment, the very ecosystems on which we will depend in now and in the future to feed us. So it's the future generations that are not being well looked after here either. Big threats, some are already becoming locked in, climate change already happening. Tim talked about our imports of fruit and veg. Fruit imports, so about 80% of the fruit we eat is imported, and a third of it's coming from climate vulnerable, water stressed countries. We will not be able to rely on those imports, so that means we'll have to be producing more here, which has big implications for nature. We'll talk about that in a bit, and Tim touched on that. And we've got obviously nature loss. Our recent State of Nature report that came from the big conservation organisations made that very clear. We have not sorted out in any way the problems that we identified in the first State of Nature report many years ago. Still getting declines, particularly of invertebrates, really appalling data. And that's partly to do with some of the locked-in problems like neonicotinoid pesticides still in the soil and the water system, still harming the invertebrates that we rely on for pollination, from pest control, etc. So business as usual is not an option. I think Tim made that very clear. And it's a local and a regional and a national and a global problem. all of them have to be addressed, and it's about the system, as Tim talked about. We can't just sort out farming. We have to sort out the supply chain. We have to sort out consumption. We have to sort out trade. And just to finish off, I often feel I have to say this: we don't need more food. One of the big pushes, particularly around the Ukraine invasion, is that we need more food to feed us. We need, UK can feed the world. We're very efficient food producers. We don't need more food. We have enough to feed 11 billion now. We just don't use it well. And we don't allow many countries and many people to actually afford good food. There's loads within that, but we don't need to push the land nature further than it already has been pushing. In fact, we need to do less, but we can do it better. Next slide, please. I thought I'd just explore what I mean by eating. There's obviously a huge emotional response when you talk to people. Like if you're working within the trust or within a nature area and you talk to people about the food, people immediately have an emotional response. Even if they rationalize it quickly afterwards, their emotional response is dominant. They think of what they eat, what their children eat, what they eat from culture, from their grandparents, and it makes it quite difficult to have a rational discussion unless you recognize that and work on that. It's a huge emotional result. And I say that coming from 25 years of trying to talk to people about meat. And, just saw the other week when meat tax idea was used by the Conservative government during its party, that they used it as a woke divisional issue, and it was really unhelpful and wrong for a start as well. But people will immediately, because of that emotional response, oppose restrictions, oppose any control, the nanny state and things like that. It's understandable reaction, but we need to move on. What we eat as a population really matters. What we're actually encouraged to eat really matters, and that's extremely important. It needs a rational approach, and the evidence, as I said, is overwhelming, as Tim's slide made absolutely clear. It's a huge, everything we eat comes from the land. Almost everything comes from the land, therefore it affects nature. And it's not just meat. Just to be clear, it's about dairy, but it's also about junk foods. And I think this is beginning to be recognized. And I'm certainly going to talk about it at the Wildlife Trust and globally. There's some really good data showing that the push for junk foods, and as I think the figures now for the UK, 54% of our food is from ultra processed foods, high sugary, fatty, oily foods, which are not good for us, but are hugely harmful for the environment because they rely on cheap ingredients, really cheap ingredients, grains, oils, fats, really cheap ingredients, and cheap meat to make hugely harmful products. And that means monocultures, it means removal of hedgerows, it means huge monocultures that are that don't provide any food for our birds, for our insects. Anyway, it's not just meat, it's junk food, it's monocultures, these kind of things, and we can do something about that, but it all affects nature. Next slide, please. Eating is all about this post-farm gate. So what happens to the food once it's left the farm gate, supply chain. I've worked on this a lot, and I think it's so important that people recognize this, because as Tim said, it's really useful that we only have to talk to a handful of retailers to get something done. It doesn't get done. We need regulation. They hold 92.5% of what we buy is just 8 retailers, but they don't want to change. Their business model is based on getting tiny amount of profit from a large amount of produce, and they get a lot more profit from the junk and from the alcohol and from the highly processed foods and luxury goods, which is why organic is getting a problem, because there's high prices of organic, they're making more than they are from non-organic. It's just so mixed up. We need to build up the alternatives. So that's the retailers, and what we choose post-farm gate makes a big difference to what happens to the food and how much energy is involved, and that affects nature because climate change affects nature as well. So fresh versus processed, as I've talked about. And what I've worked on a lot, and I released a report last December called Unpicking Food Prices, about what we pay to the farmer. So whether the farmer and the grower can actually shift to more agroecological, regenerative, whatever you want to say, more diverse farming system. Very difficult when they're squeezed so much. I'll just talk about that a tiny bit in a minute, but also what we waste. At least 30% of the food is waste along the whole chain. A lot is wasted at the domestic level. What we waste in our houses is quite extraordinary, but I think that's a lot to do with what we're encouraged to buy. Next slide, please. So the nature of loss is land use change, obviously, and this is the, obviously intensive farming, monocultures, but it relates to what you eat, and this is a sandwich factory, and everything obviously we eat is processed in some ways, unless we're getting the direct fresh produce, which is really important, because if we're buying more fresh produce, the farmer gets more of the food bound. We're getting more of the product and the nutrients within that product. For instance, beef, really nutrient dense product. Lamb, really nutrient dense product. So maybe we don't need much of it, but if we get it from the farmer or through a better food trader, we're going to get the nutrients, and the farmer will get a decent return for what is a very risky system. Next slide, please. So we did a survey of farmers a few years ago at Sustain to talk to them about the supply chain, what they needed different, because we were talking to them anecdotally. It's clear there's a problem. They're not getting enough. And 56% of farmers wanted a different market beyond the supermarkets. Then the further 20% would consider it, but obviously most of them are selling either to manufacturers and the food service sector and the retailers who don't think about nature or climate. They might pay lip service to it, and they might be demanding changes from the farmers on the farm at the farm gate in the farm, but not paying enough for those changes. And the farmers wanted to see more food hubs, more opportunities to sell local and regional, box schemes, which you might know about, farmers markets, selling more directly from the farmers. So there's a whole organization now called the Better Food Traders Network, which is growing every month practically, and they represent those who are selling produce more directly, so more of the money goes to the farmer, and with values like worker treatment, worker wages, and environment, and nature and climate. So we did these 2 reports, Beyond the Farm Gate, and led us to look at the food prices in more detail. Next slide, please. This is just one of the illustrations. It's quite a detailed report. We got a professor of accountancy called Lisa Jack, who actually got, via Tim's outfit, the City Centre for Food Policy at City University. She'd done a piece of work for them, which was really interesting because it showed how the whole system is on a knife edge. Retailers are on a knife edge because they're so competitive. It's getting worse. And the result is this. You can see where all the costs are in a sliced wrapped loaf on a supermarket shelf. All those costs, to the baker, retailer, miller, and the farmer has costs, obviously a lot of costs. And this is where the profits go. She did a look at a load of data from industry and government. This isn't a case study or a snapshot. The farmer gets 0.09p. Of a slice of loaf. And you can imagine if you doubled that, that wouldn't add much to the price of a loaf, but it will make a huge difference to the farmer. There's loads of other data in the report, and we did carrots, apples, burgers, and cheese as well. But it was really, really dramatic data. Really, I'm still getting quoted. We were in The Guardian this week as a result of this work, showing just how poorly the system works to ensure farmers can farm sustainably. Next slide, please. And we need to rethink food systems, and that's complex. And so farmers have to build in skills, build in training and demonstration and knowledge into what is an agroecological system. And agroecology means not just what happens on the farm, but what happens beyond the farm gate, as I was discussing earlier. That is critical. And agroecology is about making your system more complex on the farm, building natural systems to build soil fertility, really nurturing the pollinators and the pest predators like the slugs, the parasitoids, which can really reduce your need for insecticides. I know a lot of farmers who've totally eliminated insecticides by building their capacity to have pest predators within the system. And those predators need shelter. They need food sources. They need ways to travel through the farm in hedgerows, woodlands, messy bits, field headlands, and all sorts of these things, which is messy. And it's totally different from the monoculture, neat farming systems that we've had built up over the last 50 years in response to the great demand for more food. But now we know what we need. We don't need more food. We waste a huge amount of it because it's marketed so well. Anyway, the complexity is good, but it's harder for farmers. But the more we as consumers and we as carers about nature can talk about this and be ambassadors for agroecology and for farmers doing the right thing and supporting farmers doing the right thing, the better, because we'll shift the balance in favor of good farm systems. Next slide, please. So a transition to agroecological farming, the data, and there's some really good data from a research institute, could reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 38%. And as Tim showed, it's a huge part of the greenhouse gas emissions is from the food system. Offset a further 60% of greenhouse gas emissions through the food system by storing and capturing and storing carbon. Massive reduction in fertilizer and pesticides, which have a huge impact on the soil biology, obviously on the environment. We all know about neonicotinoid insect damage, but there's much more that's happening. I'll go quicker. Actually, 70% of land being released for nature restoration. Phase out of imported food from deforested land, absolutely critical, and move to a more mixed farming approach, building livestock into systems in ways that really work to build a soil fertility. Next slide, please. So just to quickly go through, the Committee on Climate Change do suggest a 35% reduction in meat and dairy. We probably need to go further than that, but that's the official data. This government hasn't done anything to really deliver that. We absolutely need governments to help us to do that. But ruminants play a vital role in nutrient recycling on farms. Grazing animals are needed to manage semi-natural systems, part of a mixed and healthy diet. And pigs and poultry can be that as part of pastured poultry, part of waste cycling systems. Pigs should be only eating waste food, not a huge amount of grains and soya from the Amazon, etc. Next slide, please. So we need political action. We need farm support based on public goods, nature restoration, engagement with the public, agroecology. So we need to build in new crops, breeds, rotations, and that's what farm support and farm advice from the government in all nations can help deliver if they get it right. And we need to be building through infrastructure investment, new processing and trading, and new routes to market for making it more regional and local. This isn't about making expensive farmers markets and expensive box schemes. This is about available to all, bridging that gap between what people need on any income they're at and what the farmers need, bridging that gap by building alternative routes to market, fair trading. We need to tackle waste, get rid of that 30% of waste. There shouldn't be any food waste, full stop, going into landfill. And bioenergy, 120,000 hectares of the UK is given over to produce energy crops. That is not a good use of land to tackle climate. Wind farms, solar farms use a tiny amount of land. Solar farms use less land than golf courses. Let's get our priorities right. And we need to promote nature-friendly diets. Nature-friendly diets is what it's about. And personally, you can act as a citizen, voting, talking to people about it, being an ambassador for good farming systems, and eat with nature in mind. Direct, accredited, less processed, less and better meat if you can, or no meat if you want to. Support the farmers and spread the word. Next slide, please. That's it. Oh my God, I managed to do it in the time. Thank you, and happy eating with and for nature. And that's just a slide, a picture of my book, which came out a bit ago, which covers a lot of this, covers the politics as well as how wonderful invertebrates are. And I have a particular passion for invertebrates, which I hope I'll bring to the Wildlife Trusts. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Vicki. I'm going to ask both Vicki and Tim to turn their cameras back on and join us if they can. And I'm going to ask our events team to stop sharing just for a moment so we can see the speakers. Wonderful. We do have some time for some questions, which is great. So, and we had a lot come in. I could see Tim was busy beavering away in the background, answering as many as he possibly could while Vicki was speaking, because there's no way we would have gotten to all of them in the time we have. We had a range from politics to technology to agriculture to all sorts of things have come in. So I'm going to try and, I suppose, divide it into a few kind of areas and right down to individual action as well. And so it might be a kind of amalgamation of some questions, but we will try to get to as many as we can. So there was quite a lot in the questions about plant-based eating versus meat. Vicki, you alluded to it in your presentation about eating less meat, but better meat.
Yeah.
And one of the people in the comments put about regeneratively produced beef,
Yep.
lamb, chicken. So I guess that, and whereas other questions were talking about, commenting about really needing to see a shift to make plant-based eating the norm and make that a public shift. Could we as Wildlife Trust be making sure that we're providing for that in events that we cater, going more plant-based or considering where our food's coming from? So I guess the question is really about that messaging of plant-based versus all meat eating is evil. Could you guys talk a little bit more about that? Maybe Vicki first.
Yeah, shall I go first? It's very emotive and very difficult to talk to people. So you need to talk to people carefully about it. And I'm very much of the mind that we need to eat less and better, and animals have a role to play. But there is a big problem that the majority of the meat we eat is from very intensive factory farm systems, as in a nation, which has huge animal welfare, antibiotics, pesticide, fertilizer problems, because they're all fed on crops. But switching entirely to intensively grown crops to produce plants is not necessarily the solution either. What we've got is a huge opportunity here to build into really good rotations, legumes, peas and beans, which are great as proteins. They're fantastic at fixing nitrogen because they have nodules in their roots which fix nitrogen through nitrogen fixing bacteria. Complex soil wonderfulness, and those crops can be a really fantastic part of a rotation. So building more complex rotations, which is difficult for farmers, big risk, we need to de-risk that, but those can be wonderful plant bases for foods. And you can have a bit of meat, maybe, having half and half beef stew with lentils. And I actually saw a lentil crop with the wonderful Wakelins farm a few weeks ago, with lentils, tiny lentils growing in Britain. How brilliant is that? So, we have an opportunity here to really support farmers doing that and reduce our use absolutely of meat where we don't know it's come from. And Wildlife Trust should not using meat where it doesn't know where it's come from, and dairy, and supporting the farmers doing it right. And there is a big growth in direct sales and opportunities there. Well, Tim, talk.
No, I think you've said it. I won't add any more. Let's sort of move on. This is a running debate, and we have to do it. I mean, there are some very interesting trends. Young people are eating less meat and dairy. Maybe generational shifts will occur. And you're right, Vicki's absolutely right. Diet is incredibly emotional, but the hardliners, of which I'm one, just say events are going to change this. Events, dear boy, events, and they're coming. You've just seen the impact of Ukraine. People like me have been dribbling on about these things. Our food system is incredibly fragile, and the answer from the big food companies says, no, it isn't. Look, we've fed everyone, and in COVID it was all perfect. It was okay. Really? 40% of households with 2 children in Britain, the parents are going without food 1 or 2 days a week or a month. The data aren't good, actually. Depends which way you look at. So what people eat is shaped not just by their rights, it's shaped by events. And health is part of those events. People change when they have babies, they change when they have a heart attack. We've got to try and get better ways of changing than other big life experiences, making people reconsider their diet.
And it won't stop you getting your kids to school on time. If you change it, it won't stop you, your health, all these things. So we need to have that conversation.
Well, let's thank you both. Let's see if we can get another couple questions in. There was also a question, a couple questions actually, and one that I had as well, which was around, I suppose, a mix of politics and land use. I'll start with Tim on this one. One person asked a question about Labour's promise of new towns, which I think you talked about. You started a written answer to them.
Yeah, I wrote.
Will that affect land use? I had a question about do either of you have any hope that a change in government might enable better food policies in this country? And there was also a question about with, again, land use, more farmland being purchased by lifestyle, institutional, environmental investors. How do we consider land use and how does food production and land resilience fit into that? So it's a sort of convoluted question, but I guess it's about politics in terms of, will change in government enable this sort of land use and food policy discussion to start, and what's the best way of us being involved in that? I guess I'll start with you, Tim.
Yeah, very, very quickly. This is a great question, and one of the many reasons I say I'll do things like this for you is because, you know, there's a really literate constituency of which you're part and I'm part, which is now discussing these things. It's about weighing up how do we juggle these complexities and get something for the public good without destroying the infrastructure on which we all depend. And I put in my reply, Karen, my written reply to whoever it was who put this, was a land use framework we keep on being told is going to be coming, and it keeps on not coming. But we've got an election next year. Who knows? Labour has been very quiet, frankly, about it. It's been watching it. It's not helped that they've had a churn of the senior ministers, but there is a constancy more of the junior ministers, the junior shadow ministers. And there, I think they're beginning to get it. They're getting the fact that Britain, out of Europe, has got to have a more grown-up policy-making process. We were actually very important players in the European Union. And for me, one of the sad things about leaving it is we've actually got what we've argued for 30 years with the farm-to-fork strategy. Britain needs a farm-to-fork strategy itself, and we haven't got one. Wales and Scotland are beginning to get them. England is the problem. So here we are in Bucks and Oxen. There's a key issue here, and you've got to be rolling up your sleeves. I'm going to be very political, but non-party political. It's just whoever is in government, we have got to get them to take A, land use more seriously, and B, connect it to food and the environment and public health. And they won't do it because they'll duck and dive, that they being the politicians, unless we make them do it. We've got to have an alliance, and I'll be frank, that's one of the reasons I said I would do this for you, because I think you people are really important to articulate what I've put in the chat, what we call in academia a multi-criteria approach. You don't just say food's good if it's cheap, or food's good if it's good for the environment, or food's good if it's a low dairy, low meat diet. We've got to have a multi-criteria approach to food, wherever people are, whatever diet they're used to, that we're actually ticking more of the boxes than we're doing at the moment. And I personally, I don't know about Vicki, more and more I come down to the fact that I think the future lies in shorter supply chains. We're not going to get more money to primary producers to do good horticulture or good meat and dairy culture unless the primary producers get more money. They get next to no money, is what Vicki was rightly saying. I think shorter chains and more diverse chains may be one of the ways we've got to go. Vicki.
Yeah, just touching on, I did write a report a few years ago. Do you remember the last election was loads about trees? Tree planting is the answer to climate change, you know. And I wrote a report, Green and Pressured Land, looking at all the different multi-featured pressures on our land. And we got, you know, HS2 as well, but house building, obviously a big one. People are concerned about solar. So we need a land use framework. We need a land use framework that's developed with in a democratic process. And that is the last thing I think that's been promised, that's still sort of hanging in there from the National Food Strategy. Theresa Coffey said at the Conservative conference that it's coming in this quarter, Tim. Let's hold up our hands. But I don't expect much from it. But also the Labour Party. I was at the Labour Party conference, and they also said their policy is to do a land use framework. And a lot of other things as well, like new entrants and all sorts of cooperatives, all sorts of interesting things. But one thing that gave me a bit of hope, and I am party apolitical, I'm not advocating any party, but Steve Reed, the new Secretary of State, Shadow Secretary of State in Labour, did one of the wildlife trust wildlife events, and I would encourage you to watch that, because he may be bad, I don't know when he comes in, but he said some really good positive things about linking nature to health, nature to environment, nature to their policies. And at the end of that, I was quite positive, and I had a little bit of hope. So watch that Wildlife, which is up now on the Wildlife Trust YouTube. But there's nothing more important than getting the land framework right. All those questions are absolutely right, and it's not easy.
Yeah. I'm just going to go for one more question, I think, because we need to move on to the next session, part of our session in about 3 minutes time. So I think we'll just do one more question to both of you, which is a lot of what we've talked about today was this quite big picture stuff: policy, agriculture, systems, government. And I had written this question down as you were both speaking, but somebody else put it in the questions themselves. So I think we'll end on this one, which is, let's bring it down to an individual level. If we as individuals want to bring about food systems change in the UK, what are the best steps we can take to start that? And if you guys can keep it reasonably brief, apologies for that, but yes, the kind of practical steps that we can take as individuals, I think, might be a nice one to finish on.
Shall I go first?
Why
Yeah,
not?
yeah. There's that wonderful phrase: "Eat food, eat less, mostly plants," that Michael Polanoy said. You know, in terms of what you eat, eat food as in food that looks like food. So all those kind of things you can do. Have a nature-friendly diet, and there's a lot of advice online on that. Eating Better is a good alliance to look at that as well. But if you're involved in food industry, but also, I said in my talk, be an ambassador for nature. When you're talking to people about food and why it matters for nature, and also how you vote, how you engage with your local and national government. Those three things, and what you do in your garden as well, matters. So have a bit of a plan for nature when you're thinking of food.
Yeah, just to add to that, which I agree with. One of the things I'd like from a government is sustainable dietary guidelines. Believe it or not, we have nutrition guidelines. They get flouted. They're not taken seriously. They should be, but really we need sustainable dietary guidelines. The Nordic Council of Ministers has shown that these things are possible. It's been highly contentious at the European level. I've spent 20 years of my life on this, but that's one very simple thing. It would make a lot of difference if contracts could be encouraged to deal, if you like, both with calories and with carbon by having sustainable dietary guidelines. And the final point I make, Karen, is, I'm originally trained as a psychologist. That's how I got into this. I was interested, I did my PhD partly on neuroses about food and phobias, but in an indirect way. I think it's really important to enjoy your food. One of the great things that's happened in Britain, compared to when I came back as a child from India, the British are less frightened of food. They've become a bit more inventive, but it's all been commercialized and commodified. It's made by brands, not by you. And there's a very important issue, I think, about feeling confident in our food and enjoying it, actually. A plant-based diet is great and is important, but there's a danger, there's a sort of commodification of a plant-based diet. Someone in the chat actually asked us, Vicki, could an ultra-processed food be plant-based food, or can a plant-based food be ultra-processed? The answer is yes. We're seeing them on the market. If I may be very frank, crap.
And on that note,
a well-known scientific term, Karen.
It's a technical term. On that note, I can think
enjoy
here to your last point about enjoying your food and us all cooking a bit more. It's one of my own personal hobbies, so I'm all for it. Enjoying.
Don't start me there, Karen. If you want to have a low carbon diet, get it out of a factory.
Yeah.
Per unit,
well
they can do it much better. But that's not the point. The point is, that's why I was saying we've got to have a multi-criteria approach. Carbon must be reduced in what we eat, but also taking control over it. And that's probably about, how do we cook? And do we need to cook so much?
Yes,
on that note,
I don't like cooking. There you go.
This is
you leave
interesting. Now we're have this discussion.
Right, panel, behave yourselves. This is a good link to Estelle here.
I'm going back to write to my report.
May I say thank you so much to both Vicki and Tim, and I'm really sorry to those of you we didn't get a chance to get to all the questions. We probably could have gone on all afternoon with this because there's so many interesting points that came up and so much content that you packed into your talk. The presentation is being recorded and will be available afterwards, so you will have time to digest Tim and Vicki's slides and look more in depth at it. But a big thank you once again to both Vicki and Tim for your time today. It's been wonderful to have you here. Thank you both very much.
Yeah, and just thank you very much. I've been scribbling away, and definitely we rise to the challenge. So yes, one for the team to take away and have a think about. Coming up to the next election, you know, this is a great opportunity actually to use this now to put some pressure on all political parties. So thank you.
I'm going to go. I'm afraid I've got to go. It's raining and I've got to get my washing in. But bye, everyone.
Okay. Thank you, guys. Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Bye.
I just had a
take it away, Estelle.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. Thank you ever so much, everybody. Right. Okay. So Karen, are you staying? Are you going, or what are you up to?
I'm staying, but I'm going to let you do the talking at this point.
Okay. Okay. All right. Well, welcome everybody now to this last section of the afternoon. I think that was absolutely inspirational, the last two talks. So this is a lovely way to wrap up the session. So we're really pleased to run our popular photography competition again this year. The contest invited people of all ages to take amazing pictures of wildlife or scenery across the 3 counties, or to capture people taking action for nature in their community. We also had a new category, an urban nature category this year as well. And we were quite overwhelmed, I have to say, to have so many wonderful entries with some truly stunning images of wildlife, landscapes and people in our area. We had almost 450 photographs submitted across 12 categories, which is just brilliant. So as you can imagine, it was a tough job for our judges, and there was some deliberation as the standard was so high. A big thank you to our sponsors, GG Wildlife Experiences, and to wildlife photographer Steve Godds, who kindly helped us judge the entries and has provided some wildlife photography masterclass workshops for our winners. And thanks also to Chroma for helping with printing. We are also grateful to our editor of Wildlife magazine, Ben Van Heems, and to BBOUT's website design officer, Chris Deeney, who used their eye for a good photo to help pick the winners. So here's a video from our judging panel to reveal this year's category winners and runners-up.
Well, on behalf of BBOUT, I'd like to say a massive thank you to everybody that took part in the photo competition. This year we had a few new categories, which only meant an even wider range of wonderful wildlife photos to select from. It did not make the judging easy. It's great to see people interested and taking action for wildlife, both on their doorstep, in their community, and of course out at our nature reserves. Thank you, everyone.
You guys really don't make it easy for us, do you? The quality this year has been exceptional. What I've loved is seeing photographs of people clearly passionate about wildlife from all different age groups, and it's lovely to see entries from the children and teens as well. Well, it's been such a joy judging this, and wow, you guys have really given us a hard job this year. Thanks so much.
Well, we thought last year was hard. This year's been so much harder. What's blown me away this year is the insect category. My passion is birds, as most people know, but this year the insects have just been amazing. The winners we've had to deliberate over many times, so well-worthy winner at the end. Well, you'll wait and see, but well done to everyone for entering.
Wow, that's truly, truly inspiring, I have to say. So congratulations to all of our winners. Some incredible photos there, absolutely brilliant, and I'd love to use some of those in our office, so we'll get around to that. Thanks to the judges as well. That wasn't an easy job by any means. So now I have the lovely job of announcing the overall winner of BBOUT's photography competition 2023. So drum roll please, and I will do that at home. I'm delighted to announce that the overall winner of the BBOUT Photography Competition 2023 and the winner of the insect category is Harry Barks, with his amazing close-up image of a beautiful white-legged damselfly. So Harry, congratulations. That was absolutely fantastic. And the judges recognised the skill needed to take a photograph of this quality. The detail is just stunning. So a very well-deserved winner. Many congratulations to Harry, who wins our top prize of a digital camera and an A3 print of his winning image. And many congratulations then to everybody else, all of our other winners, and to everybody who took part and took their time to enter the competition this year. We're pleased to say that the winning photographs will feature in our members' Wild magazine, as well as a special BBOUT calendar for 2024, which will be available to order through our online shop soon, as well as Christmas cards, and that time is coming. Winners will also be able to enjoy a special wildlife photography masterclass with Steve from GG Wildlife Experiences. So from me, it just remains to thank our wonderful speakers today, Professor Tim Lang and Vicki Hird. They're really, really fascinating, and certainly it's laid down the challenge to us and the Wildlife Trust and other ENGOs as well in that space, who have a kind of vested interest in thinking about land use frameworks for the future and how important food is in that, for people's health as much as anything, and to benefit nature. We're really grateful for your time today, so thank you very much. And thank you to all of you who've joined this afternoon as well, and for your support for BBOUT. And just remember, we couldn't do it without you. So thank you. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and I hope to see you very soon. Thank you.